Greetings, YouTubers. It's time to refute another liberal talking point I've heard, and probably yourself as well, many times. We need more public transportation. The liberals masquerade as caring about the environment when public transportation isn't as environmentally friendly as you'd think, and tell us that we need more public transportation. Of course, public transportation, like every other government central planning endeavor, is a joke that will require those who don't ride it to subsidize it. If you don't want to ride inefficient and pathetic public transportation, the liberals would legislate you right out of your car. Let's begin and ask the question, is public transportation as currently run and subsidized by the government efficient and worth all the money we spend on it? Peter Rogoff, Hussein Obama's appointee in charge of the FTA, spoke before the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, whose transit system he pointed out is in a grim state. Nationwide, he noted, America's transit industry suffers from $78 billion worth of deferred maintenance, most of which is due to rail transit lines that cities cannot afford to keep in shape. Rogoff was disturbed that cities were asking for federal grants to build more rail lines when they can't keep the existing trains in a state of good repair. According to historic data published by the American Public Transportation Association, the productivity of public transit outputs per unit of input has declined dramatically since the federal government began funding public transit in '64. Can you believe it? From 1964 to 2008, the inflation-adjusted cost of operating transit increased by more than 360%, while transit ridership grew by a mere 24% and fares by 62%. Another story. New research by transportation expert James McIsaac shows that if you live in the Puget Sound region, you might be surprised just how officials spend your hard-earned money, says Michael Ennis, a transportation director for the Washington Policy Center. Over the past 20 years, total transportation spending in the region has risen from $1.57 billion every 2 years to $4.78 billion. That is nearly a 200% increase in transportation taxes and fees collected in the central Puget Sound region. Regional road funding has risen 80% since '91, while regional public transit funding has risen more than 450% over the same period. Public transit share of the 14 million daily person trips made in this region is now less than 3%, while transit collects 60% of all transportation tax revenues. Road funding is only 40% of all transportation taxes collected in the region. Did you get that? Road funding is only 40% of all transportation taxes collected in the region, but serves more than 97% of all person trips. You'll see that's the same case at the national level here in a minute. Since 1970, the number of workers needed to operate America's public transit systems has increased by 180%, while the inflation-adjusted cost of operating buses, light rail, and heavy rail, the only modes whose costs are known to go back to 1970, increased by 195%. Yet ridership on these modes increased by only 32%. Each transit worker produced 53,115 transit trips in 1970, but only 26,314 trips by all modes in 2008. The real cost per rider grew by 124%, while subsidies, fares minus operating costs, grew by more than 8 times. So you can see the government gets a hold of it, it becomes inefficient and expensive. What accounts for this huge decline in productivity? Simple government ownership. Prior to 1965, most transit systems were private and the industry as a whole was declining but profitable. In 1964, Congress passed the Urban Mass Transit Act, which promised federal capital grants to any government-owned transit systems. And as you predictably, government rang the cowbell, everybody came running, and now it's subsidy on top of subsidy on top of subsidy for transit systems that don't work. And nobody wants to ride them, apparently. Remember the bridge collapse in Minnesota? Only 60% of federal gas taxes goes to the construction and maintenance of highways and bridges. 30% goes to subsidized construction and maintenance of public transit facilities, such as bus terminals, light rail, and subway systems. The remaining 10% is diverted to other projects, currently 6,000 projects, including all-important bike paths, much needed museums, nature trails, historic building repairs, and so forth. That bridge collapsed. We need higher gas taxes. No, you need to use it on it. actually use it for that, not garbage, not pork. So it begs the question, why are people who drive their cars paying for museums and public transit and garbage they don't use? Make the people who use it fund it. Make a private investor build a museum and fund it. Public transportation is not more environmentally friendly either. Rail advocates often reason like this: the average car has 1.1 people in it. Compare the BTUs, or carbon emissions, per passenger mile with those from a full train. The train wins hands down. The problem with such hypothetical examples is that the numbers are always wrong. As a recent study from the University of California, Davis notes, the load factors are critical. The average commuter car has 1.1 people, but even during rush hour, most of the vehicles on the road are not transporting commuters. When counting all trips, the average is 1.6 and a little higher, 1.7 for light trucks, pickups, full-size vans, and evil SUVs. On the other hand, trains are rarely full, yet they operate all day long, while a car only runs when you turn it on and want to go somewhere. According to the National Transit Database, in 2007, the average American subway car had 25 people in it, against a theoretical capacity of 150. The average light rail car had 24 people, capacity 170. The average commuter rail car had 37 people, capacity 165, and the average bus had 11, capacity 64. In other words, our transit systems operate at about 1/6 of capacity. Even an SUV averaging 1.7 people does better than that. When Amtrak compares its fuel economy with automobiles, it relies on DOE data that presumes 1.6 people per car, but another Department of Energy report points out that cars in inner city travel tend to be more fully loaded. The average turns out to be 2.4 people. Projections that high-speed rail will be energy efficient assume high load factors, but with some of the routes in the Obama high-speed rail plan terminating in such relatively small cities as Eugene, Oregon, Mobile, Alabama, Portland, Maine, load factors will often be much lower. Even if a particular rail proposal did save a little energy in year-to-year operations, studies show that the energy cost of constructing rail lines dwarfs any annual savings. The environmental impact statement for a Portland, Oregon light rail line, and you can read about that in the book on the screen. And now I lost my place. The environmental impact statement for a Portland, Oregon light rail line found that it would take 171 years of annual energy savings to repay the energy cost of construction. They built it anyway. With capacities of more than 170, the average light rail car in Baltimore and Denver carries less than 15 people, while San Jose's carries 16. For that, we need to spend about $40 million a mile on track and $3 million per rail car versus $300,000 for a bus. And I'm going to cut it off right there and continue the rest of this in part 2. I didn't want to do it in 2 parts, obviously, but I'm not going to be able to get it all in there. It's a good stopping point. We'll continue this in part 2.